You cursed brat! Look what you've done! I'm melting! Melting! Oh, what a world! What a world! Who would have thought a good little girl like you could destroy my beautiful wickedness? Ah, look out! Look out! I'm going! Ah!
What's up, guys? It's Benny. Let me show you a grotesque and repulsive example of how immoral people can just be purchased by the corporate media for a asking price. 30 shekels of silver, shall we, for Kaitlan Collins. You may know Kaitlan Collins, a rising star at CNN. Their White House correspondent. She also has a show on CNN called The Source. Ladies and gentlemen, we have our own sources that sent us this clip a little while back. Kaitlan Collins on Fox News talking about evil globalist George Soros and the Great Replacement Theory. This was not too long ago.
Capital. Kaitlan, what does that mean? What's George Soros trying to do with the immigration crisis?
Good morning. Okay, so George Soros is this foreign-born left-wing guy who essentially wants to change the nature of our country. And in this data dump, one of the...
So she goes on to say, oh, George Soros is trying to replace Americans with an open border. Got it. Okay. Weak people sell their souls to Washington, D.C. and the corporate media. And it is a totally grotesque practice. Just a few years later, actually, Kaitlan Collins was shrieking at President Trump, the guy who's trying to stop George Soros from the Great Replacement Theory, about January 6th, and Donald Trump had to whip it out.
3 hours to tell them to go home.
I don't believe it did. Oh, let me pull it out. I have to pull it out.
Donald Trump destroying Kaitlan Collins on her own network in front of a live audience that cheered and roared as her career was atomized. President Trump continues to atomize Kaitlan Collins inside of the White House. In briefing after briefing, Donald Trump is saying, no, I'm not going to be calling on you. This is like Jim Acosta 2.0, but this time Trump has a secret weapon. It's called Roast Kaitlan Collins to her face and never stop.
Said that your national security advisor learned a lesson after a reporter.
Excuse me, I didn't make you. Go ahead, please.
Mr. President, these
Excuse me. I didn't pick you.
President, you won the White House in part because of high inflation. If your tariffs make prices go up...
Excuse me, we haven't asked you to speak yet, please. Right?
Shut up, lady. Stop yapping. We got things to do here.
Biden years ago, this should have never been allowed to happen. I know he's a friend of yours.
But couldn't Putin just withdraw his...
He's a friend of
today?
CNN. That's why nobody watches CNN anymore, because they have no credibility. Okay, who else?
So when given the opportunity to ask a question, Donald Trump goes absolute berserker mode. What I find particularly interesting about this is not just President Trump, because he did this again and again and again at the White House, including today in an awesome meeting between Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, and Donald Trump, where he just really ratcheted it up to 10, his destruction of CNN. But also that CNN has, with regularity, been destroyed on other networks and by people who didn't mean to. Just to show you how easy President Trump's job is, here's Kaitlan Collins on Stephen Colbert's show with the unintentional joke that people actually trust CNN.
You guys are objective over there, that you just report the news as it is. And I know
Is that supposed to be a laugh line?
I guess it is.
Okay. So here's President Trump doing the same bit as Stephen Colbert to CNN. Kaitlan Collins started yapping all day today and got this response.
Let's hear the question from this very low-rated anchor at CBS. It's asked by CNN, and they always ask it with a slant because they're totally slanting because they don't know what's happening. That's why nobody's watching them. But what's going to happen? Well, they'd love to have a criminal, released into it.
I mean, there's a fascination.
They would love it.
Yeah.
Sick. These are sick people. Marco, do you have something to say?
Well, Mr. President, you said that if the Supreme Court said someone needed to be returned, that you would abide by that. You said that on Air Force One just a few days ago, and they said that it must be facilitated.
Why don't you just say, isn't it wonderful that we're keeping criminals out of our country? Why can't you just say that? Why do you go over and over? And that's why nobody watches you anymore. You know, you have no credibility. Please go ahead.
Yeah, baby, President Trump demolishing CNN's Kaitlan Collins. Why don't you just say that it was wonderful and we're keeping criminals out of our country? That's why nobody watches you. Absolute fire. Another angle, just because I love it, because you can see the entire room here.
Mr. President, you said that if the Supreme Court said someone needed to be returned, that you would abide by that. You said that on Air Force One just a few days ago, and they said that
we have to answer
it must
this
be
question from
facilitated.
you? Why don't you just say, isn't it wonderful that we're keeping criminals out of our country? Why can't you just say that?
Well, it's illegal.
Why do you go over and over? And that's why nobody watches you anymore. You know, you have no credibility.
President Trump doing something I've never seen him do before. President Trump bringing in his entire cabinet to body slam Kaitlan Collins, toss her around like a rag doll. Go to town. President Trump has multiple members of his administration take turns ripping CNN's Kaitlan Collins after she asked why an MS-13 gang member was deported to El Salvador. Pam Bondi, Stephen Miller, Marco Rubio, and Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, all got in on it. Here we go.
Let's hear the question from this very low-rated anchor at CB.
Thank you, President Trump. Do you plan to ask President Bukele to help return the man who your administration says was mistakenly deported? The man who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador?
Well, let me ask Pam, would you answer that question?
Sure, President. First and foremost, he was illegally in our country. He had been illegally in our country. And in 2019, two courts, an immigration court and an appellate immigration court, ruled that he was a member of MS-13 and he was illegally in our country. Right now, it was additional paperwork had needed to be done. That's up to El Salvador if they want to return him. That's not up to us. The Supreme Court ruled, President, that if, as El Salvador wants to return him, this is international matters, foreign affairs, if they wanted to return him, we would facilitate it, meaning provide a plane.
So will you return him, President Bukele?
You are doing a great job. Thank you. Stephen Miller, wait a minute. Can you just also respond to that question? Because, you know, it's asked by CNN, and they always ask it with a slant because they're totally slanted because they don't know what's happening. That's why nobody's watching them. But would you answer that question also, please?
Yes, gladly. So, as Pam mentioned, there's an illegal alien from El Salvador. So, with respect to you, he's a citizen of El Salvador. So, it's very arrogant even for American media to suggest that we would even tell El Salvador how to handle their own citizens as a starting point. As two immigration courts found that he was a member of MS-13. When President Trump declared MS-13 to be a foreign terrorist organization, that meant that he was no longer eligible under federal law, which I'm sure you know, you're very familiar with the INA, that he was no longer eligible for any form of immigration relief in the United States. So he had a deportation order that was valid, which meant that under our law, he's not even allowed to be present in the United States and had to be returned because of the foreign terrorist designation. This issue was then, by a district court judge, completely inverted, and a district court judge tried to tell the administration that they had to kidnap a citizen of El Salvador and fly him back here. That issue was raised to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the district court order was unlawful, and its main components were reversed 9-0 unanimously, stating clearly that neither Secretary of State nor the President could be compelled by anybody to forcibly retrieve a citizen of El Salvador from El Salvador, who again is a member of MS-13, which, as I'm sure you understand, rapes little girls, murders women, murders children, is engaged in the most barbaric activities in the world, and I can promise you, if he was your neighbor, you would move right away.
So you don't plan to ask for
Supreme Court is
to get
asking
him back?
And what was the ruling in the Supreme Court, Steve? Was it 9-0?
Yes, it was a 9-0
in our favor.
In our favor, against the district court ruling, saying that no district court has the power to compel the foreign policy function of the United States. As Pam said, the ruling solely stated that if this individual, at El Salvador's sole discretion, was sent back to our country, that we could deport him a second time.
Well,
No version of this legally ends up with him ever living here because he is a citizen of El Salvador. That is the president of El Salvador. Your questions about it, per the court, can only be directed to him.
I asked
¿Usted lo
President
liberaría,
Bukele,
Presidente
what is
Bukele?
can President Bukele weigh in on this? Do you plan to return him?
Well, I'm supposed to have suggested that I smuggle a terrorist into the United States, right?
It's always
how can I return him to the United States? Like, I smuggle him into the United States, or what do I do? Of course, I'm not going to do it. It's like, the question is preposterous. How can I smuggle a terrorist into the United States? I don't have the power to return him to the United States.
But you could release him inside El Salvador.
Yeah, but I'm not releasing. We're not very fond of releasing terrorists into our country. We just turned the murder capital of the world into the safest country of the Western Hemisphere, and you want us to go back into releasing criminals so we can go back to being the murder capital of the world? No, that's not going to happen.
Well, they'd love to have a criminal, released into our country.
There's a fascination.
They would love it.
Yeah.
They're sick. These are sick people. Marco, do you have something to say about
Yeah, Stephen outlined it. I don't understand what the confusion is. This individual is a citizen of El Salvador. He was illegally in the United States and was returned to his country. That's where you deport people, back to their country of origin. Except for Venezuela, that wasn't refusing to take people back, or places like that. I can tell you this, Mr. President. No, the foreign policy of the United States is conducted by the President of the United States, not by a court. And no court in the United States has a right to conduct the foreign policy of the United States. It's that simple. End of story.
And that's what the Supreme Court held, by the way, to Marco's point. The Supreme Court said exactly what Marco said, that no court has the authority to compel the foreign policy function of the United States. We won a case 9-0, and people like CNN are portraying it as a loss, as usual, because they want foreign terrorists in the country who kidnap women and children. But President Trump, his policy is foreign terrorists that are here illegally get expelled from the country, which, by the way, is a 90-10 issue.
Well, Mr. President, you said that if the Supreme Court said someone needed to be returned, that you would abide by that. You said that on Air Force One just a few days ago, and they said that it must be facilitated.
Why don't you just say, isn't it wonderful that we're keeping criminals out of our country? Why can't you just say that? Why do you go over and over? And that's why nobody watches you anymore. You have no credibility. Please, go ahead.
President Trump, thank you so much. How many illegal criminals are you planning on?
This is just one of the most incredible moments. To have the president of El Salvador sit there and say, no, we're not going to be sending him back. We're not going to be sending one of our own homegrown terror. He's a El Salvadorian citizen. Like, why do they get tricked into this? It looks so bad. Oh, yeah, send back a citizen of El Salvador to America who's a terrorist. Amazing. Kaitlan Collins opens her mouth. Not you. You love to see the energy here at the White House. Again, this is such a change from the first administration when Jim Acosta was allowed to speak and, more importantly, did get under President Trump's skin time and time again. That's the goal here. The goal here is to have Trump lose it, yell, or scream, or throw something. This is just something that's beautiful, watching this happen. Donald Trump is just owning. And Kaitlan Collins should not be respected. People that are this transactional and that are this immoral should not be respected. Kaitlan Collins, who can just for 30 shekels of silver, just flip and do whatever. Do the next thing, right? Join one side or the other. She's now a far left-wing, screeching leftist. Never, ever trust anybody like that. You don't deserve respect, okay? That's why I do the setup there. That's why you have to see that clip to understand what this is. She's just an actress being paid to do a song and dance. That's it. It's pretty sad. Ladies and gentlemen, happy here in our little humble studio, far away from Washington, D.C. Like, share, and subscribe. If you agree. See ya.